Welcome to this online talk, The Pickardstown Ambush and the Aftermath, by Dr. Pat McCarthy, who will explore the events of the Pickardstown Ambush, organised in January 1921 by the East Waterford Brigade, and look at the aftermath of this event, at which 2 members of the brigade sadly lost their lives and others were badly wounded. Pat is a native of Waterford and a past pupil of Mount Sion. He holds a PhD and an MBA from UCD and worked for many years in the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector. He is the author of The Irish Revolution, 1912 to 1923, Waterford, Waterford and the 1916 Rising, and The Redmonds in Waterford, A Political Dynasty, 1891 to 1952. He has also published extensively in journals. He is currently a research associate in the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University and is working on a history of the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry in Ireland. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, this commemorative event is being made available to you online, and further events will be postponed to later in the year. This online talk is part of the Waterford Decade of Centenaries events programme, supported by Waterford City and County Council and the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media under the Decade of Centenaries 2012 to 2023 initiative. Gwyn Thanavas.
Hi, my name is Pat McCarthy, and I've long had an interest in the history of Waterford, and in particular, the history of Waterford during the War of Independence, on which I've published a book with Four Courts Press, and I also did one for the City and County Council on Waterford and the 1916 Rising. And what I want to talk about now is the Pickardstown Ambush, which happened on the night of January the 7th and the 8th, 1921, and, very importantly, the aftermath of that ambush. The Pickardstown Ambush was the defining incident, the defining event in the history of the 1st Waterford Brigade, the East Waterford Brigade. Now, brigades were the basic IRA structure during the War of Independence, and this map here gives you an idea of how many brigades there were. There were about 48 brigades in all. Some counties, such as Carlow and Laois, had 1 brigade. Others, such as Cork, had 4 brigades. It depended on the size of the county and the population. And these brigades were later organised into divisions. In Waterford, there were 2 brigades. Number 1, East Waterford, and number 2, West Waterford. And they were combined with the Kerry Brigades, the West Limerick Brigade, the Cork Brigades into the 1st Southern Division. This is the way Waterford was organised during the War of Independence. The 1st Waterford Brigade, the East Waterford Brigade, had 3 battalions, one centred on the city, one centred on Tramore, Galtier, and the other on Dunhill and areas like that. The 2nd Waterford Brigade, the West Waterford Brigade, covered far more territory, with the 1st Battalion centred on Dungarvan. The hinterland of Carrick-on-Suir, up around Clonea Power, was part of the Tipperary No. 3 Brigade. The commander of the East Waterford Brigade was Willie Walsh, a long-time IRB veteran, well-known GA referee, after whom Welsh Park is called. He had been in command. He had endeavoured to organise the Waterford Brigade for the 1916 Rising, and in 1917-1918, himself and Sean Matthews were instrumental in reorganising the Waterford Brigade after the Rising. In 1918, such was the influx of volunteers into the brigade, it was decided to split the brigade into 2, the East Waterford Brigade and the West Waterford Brigade. Now, that was the IRA disposition. The Crown Forces, mostly RIC. You can see the number of barracks, the network of barracks that crisscrossed the county. And as well as that, there were Coast Guard stations along the coast. And later, as the war developed, there were military posts, the Devonshire Regiment in Waterford, with over 1,000 men, some of them dispersed into garrisons in Carrick-on-Shore and New Ross, and the East Kent Regiment, the Buffs, with stations in Dungarvan, Lismore and Fermoy. It was crisscrossed, as I said, with RIC stations, and these were the primary targets. The East Waterford Brigade began in 1919, like most other brigades, with small-scale activities. 1919 was primarily due to raiding for arms. As an example, Jeremiah Cronin records, "We did raid a few private houses for arms. I myself took part in at least 2 of these raids, on the house of Scully an architect in Parnell Street and on Bailey's New Street. In Scully's we got 2 shotguns and in Bailey's we got 1. In these 2 instances, I was in charge of a small party of 2 men. I was myself armed with a .32 revolver. My comrades were not armed. So all they get is shotguns, a few revolvers, and virtually no rifles." In 1920, the struggle began. In April, you had a lot of the RIC posts were evacuated, and those were all burnt. In Callahan, the RIC barracks, the barrack was unoccupied. We brought out a few gallons of petrol and set fire to the building to prevent its reoccupation by enemy forces. William Keane thought along the same lines, and the Holy Cross barracks, we brought along some petrol and some gelignite and completely destroyed the building. That was common all over the country. In April 1920, about 240 RIC barracks that had been evacuated were burnt across the country. Now, the East Waterford Brigade, a few words about that. The East Waterford Brigade was one of the smallest brigades in the country. It had about 450 members between the 3 battalions. It was very poorly armed, and crucially, it had lost East Waterford, Waterford City, the only place in the south of the country where the Sinn Féin had lost not 1 but 2 elections, the by-election in March 1918 and the general election in November that year. So there was this feeling in Waterford, in East Waterford, particularly in the city, of being almost in enemy territory. Waterford City and its environs could be described as the only place in the south where one could be a nationalist by supporting William Redmond and not support Sinn Féin. Now, in 1919, Paddy Paul joined the brigade. He had served with the British Army throughout the war, had been promoted, and now he gave his commitment to the IRA. He rapidly climbed the ranks in the East Waterford Brigade, became training officer, and then became second in command of the brigade to Willie Walsh. On the 18th of September, he attempted an attack on one of the few RIC barracks left occupied in East Waterford, and that was on the 18th of September. The barracks was there in Kill, and on the 18th of September, Paddy Paul mobilised about 60 men who would block the roads leading into the village, and then Paul himself would lead about 30 picked men in an attack on the barracks. Now, for a number of reasons, that attack failed, but it showed Paul's ability to mobilise the men and get them into the field. There was one outcome of the attack on Kill Barrack, on the constabulary barrack in Kill. The RIC evacuated the barracks, which, of course, the IRA claimed credit for. They withdrew the men to Port Law. But one constable had his family in the village, and used to visit them. And a number of volunteers, including a newly recruited volunteer named Power, in an unauthorized attack, decided to attack Constable Cullen and disarm him. When they tried to do that, Cullen retreated into his house and from the upstairs window threw a grenade at the attackers. One of them, the newly joined volunteer Power, died from that incident. Despite that, coming back here, you had the death of volunteer James Power. On the 5th of December, Paddy Paul mobilised 6 other volunteers. And with this, all the rifles in the brigade, it had only 7 rifles, staged an ambush at Ballyduff. Ballyduff was a perfect point for an ambush, and since there was constant military traffic between Waterford and the British Army Brigade HQ at Fermoy, they knew sooner or later a lorry would come along. One did. They opened fire, wounded one of the British Army soldiers, who returned fire. They also came near to wounding their Brigadier Willie Welsh. Welsh had been arrested and the lorry was transporting him to Fermoy. The British Army interpreted it as an attempt to free Willie Welsh, but it was just an opportunistic ambush. But it was a pattern that, again, Paddy Paul was getting his men into action. After the ambush at Ballyduff Glen, Paul was made brigadier. That was the norm. If the brigadier was arrested, his second in command took over. So on the 1st of January, the brigade staff was Paddy Paul. His second in command, the vice officer commanding, was William Keane. Dennis Madden was the intelligent officer, Matthew Knox, the quartermaster, and Thomas Wylie, the adjutant. But the key man in all of this was Paddy Paul. He's there seated second from the left. That's a photograph taken of members of the East Waterford Brigade after they have taken over the military barracks in January 1922. So that's Paddy Paul, the driving force at this stage behind the attack, behind the East Waterford Brigade. Now, on the 1st of November, the West Waterford Brigade had staged a brilliant ambush at Pilltown. A couple of times they had attacked Ardmore RIC barracks, but without success. This time they decided to attack the RIC barracks, but that was not the real target. In the previous attempts, the British Army had always sent a lorry load of troops to relieve the garrison at Ardmore. This time, that relieving force would be the target. On the 1st of November, they staged a diversionary attack on Ardmore RIC barracks. The garrison there, the RIC, sent up very light flares, and in reply, the British Army sent a lorry load of soldiers towards Ardmore. As it rounded the corner at Pilltown Cross, it crashed into a barricade. The soldiers spilt out. The IRA who were waiting opened fire. One British soldier was killed, a number of others wounded, and the others surrendered. A perfect success. They captured 18 rifles, a half a dozen revolvers, 2,000 rounds of ammunition, and they suffered no casualties themselves. For Paddy Paul, that was the model for success. Now he decided to repeat the exercise in East Waterford. The first thing he did was to secure the help of the West Waterford Brigade, who by now, as a result of Pilltown, were well armed and had experience of combat. He also decided that Tramore would be the target. At this stage, in East Waterford, there were only 4 occupied barracks outside the city: Portlaw, Tramore, Dunmore, and Passage East. he decided that Dunmore East and Passage were not suitable for an attack because they were up against the estuary, up against the sea, and that would cut down on the number of possible escape routes if anything went wrong. Portlaw could be relieved by soldiers coming from Waterford or from Carrick. So he wouldn't know which way they would come. That was impractical. That left Tramore. His second decision was that this would be a night attack. Now, there was a lot of criticism subsequently of the decision to stage a night attack because, particularly with a volunteer, inexperienced force, command and control at night time would be a problem. But Paddy Paul later, 30 years later, tried to justify that decision, and it's worthwhile looking at why he decided on a night attack. And I'll read what he said. In planning this ambush at Tramore, there were a number of considerations involved. To begin with, I wanted to have this action in the heart of an area which was regarded by the enemy as absolutely quiet and safe. The terrain thereabouts was, however, absolutely flat and unsuitable for our operations in daylight. And this fact, therefore, compelled us to adopt a night attack, although I realised that night operations are always dangerous because of the inability to control forces and the likelihood of their becoming scattered and detached. There was also a very good road network in this area, which made it an easy matter for the enemy, equipped with motor vehicles, to surround us, and difficult for us on our part to avoid this if we carried out the operation in daylight. It was these considerations which influenced the carrying out of the Tramore ambush as a night attack, owing to the location of the enemy posts. Now, let's look at the plan. Tramore barracks, RIC barracks, would be fired upon. They would send for help. And as they approached Tramore, they would be attacked. Now, the location of the ambush was a problem, finding a good spot, because the British Army had an option. They could come by what we would now call the main road from Waterford to Tramore, or they could come the old road. And you would not know in advance which road they were coming. So any ambush had to take place after the junction there at Ballynatton. Up at the top of the screen, you will see 18 riflemen. These would be the West Waterford men, coming from West Waterford, taking up position there. 18 riflemen. There would be 20 shotgun men on the railway embankment. Shotguns, of course, are a short-range weapon. They were also short of ammunition. But they would take up position along the embankment, and these could retreat along the Pickardstown road if necessary. You can see a barricade there after the railway bridge. The idea was that the first truck, and they anticipated 2, maybe 3 at most, would come around the corner, travelling at some speed, would crash into the barricade, and they would come under intense fire from the West Waterford riflemen. The second or third truck would be where the 20 shotgun men could fire on them, and also the rest of the East Waterford men, about 16 shotgun men very near the road, and 8 riflemen further back up to support them. There was also positioned 4 riflemen at the junction, and the idea is they would fire into the rear of the men. So, all going well, 2 or 3 trucks will be trapped, be stopped by the barricade, and will come under intense fire from the riflemen, from the shotgun men on both sides of the road, and from the 4 riflemen who were firing from behind. They would be fired upon from every angle, and success was anticipated. It was fixed for the night of January the 7th. And at about 7:30 on that night, about 20 men from the Waterford City Battalion mobilised in the grounds of the mental hospital, where the battalion arms dump was located. Armed with 8 rifles, 12 shotguns, and a few revolvers, and commanded by William Keane, the brigade vice OC, they set off for Tramore. Tom Brennan of Tramore led the way through the rain and the darkness, across country at first to avoid detection, then along the old Tramore road to the rendezvous point at Ballynatton Cross. Earlier that day, Andrew Kirwan, brigade transport officer with the West Waterford Brigade, had commandeered 4 motor cars at gunpoint to carry himself and about 20 others under the command of George Lennon and Pat Keating. By the time others from Ballymahon and Dunhill made their way towards the site by bicycle. In all, some 60 men assembled at the crossroads. By this time, the rain had stopped and the night was fine but cold. Commandant Paul conferred with Pax Whelan, Brigade OC of the West Waterford Brigade, and George Lennon, who was command of the West Waterford Flying Column. Then, Paul himself, the men were deployed and were told not to fire until the first lorry had been stopped by the barricade. The men took their positions to wait. Meanwhile, Paul himself, and this is crucial, Paul himself and 5 others entered Tramore to mount the feint attack. With 2 men, he approached the front of the RIC barracks, while the others took up position to the rear of the building. Just after 11 p.m, they opened fire. The RIC replied with rifle fire and grenades, while sending up very lights to summon help from Waterford City. Paul had also been careful not to cut the telephone wire. After a brisk exchange of fire lasting about 15 minutes, Paul led his men back towards the ambush position, and there he spoke briefly to George Lennon. Then suddenly they heard a single shot from the far side of the railway. They're now near Tramore, and he heard a single shot fired from the junction, from near the junction at Pickardstown, at Ballynatton there. That was followed by sustained firing. Something had clearly gone wrong. Paul now could not use the road to access the main position along the Ballynatton Road where the shrine is. Instead, he had to make his way across fields, across the stream, across the marsh up to it. So what had gone wrong? When the request for assistance came from Tramore, the British Army in the military barracks dispatched about 80 troops in 4 lorries. They came along the old road, as shown here, and 2 of them had gone down onto the main road, when one shotgun man prematurely discharged his shotgun. The lorries immediately screeched to a halt. The troops jumped out. No lorry had gone underneath the metal bridge, so the West Waterford riflemen had no target to fire at. The other shotgun men joined in, but the troops had dismounted, were behind the ditches, returning fire. The shotgun men were ineffective. The 4 riflemen at the corner fired and then retreated. Similarly, the shotgun men fired the 4 or 5 cartridges they had and then retreated. 2 of the British Army lorries had stopped on the old road outside the ambush position. They began to advance across the fields under the command of a Lieutenant Yo, who later that year would be decorated for his leadership and bravery at the Pickardstown Ambush. Yo led his men into the field. So now the men on the Ballynatton Road were trapped between the troops on the main road and Lieutenant Yo and his men advancing across the fields to their rear. Almost immediately when they opened fire, Michael McGrath, the first shotgun man on the right, was shot and killed. The riflemen further up the road came under fire from the troops, the Devonshire Regiment, advancing across the field. Michael Wylie was wounded in the legs. Nicky Whittle was hit 3 times, badly wounded, and collapsed. William Keane, the Vice Brigadier, the second in command, tried to order the men to disperse and to make their way back. In the meantime, Paddy Paul had reached the road and all was in confusion. All he could do was try and extricate the men. As the men retreated, as the shotgun men retreated, the riflemen tried to cover them. Meanwhile, British troops had reached the road. They saw Nicky Whittle lying there. They were satisfied Michael McGrath was dead. They saw Nicky Whittle lying in the ditch, bleeding. One of them was about to finish him off with his bayonet when the IRA riflemen, led by John O'Brien of Dunhill, opened fire. They immediately turned their attention, which gave Whittle a chance to roll over the ditch down into the field, into the furze bushes, Ballynatton, the townland of the furze. After an exchange of fire in which John O'Brien was killed trying to cover the men who were trying to escape, Michael Wylie, helped by Tom Brennan, was carried away, and the others managed to retreat. The West Waterford men, having nothing to fire at because the railway embankment was in their way, all they could do was retreat. The British Army picked up the 2 corpses, that of Michael McGrath and Tom O'Brien, and headed back to Waterford. They searched but did not find Nicky Whittle. They believed that he had been killed, but that the IRA had carried away his body. One by one, the men made their way back to Waterford or to Dunhill. The next day, the town Waterford was awash with rumour about it. Various numbers were bandied around, but soon it was agreed that 3 IRA had been killed, many wounded, and the British Army had suffered only minor wounds. There you see the railway embankment. On the side where the ambush should have been, you can see some rocks which had helped to form the barricade, along with at least one overturned cart. But you can also see the height of the embankment and how the West Waterford men were unable to join in the actual fighting that took place. The RIC barracks bore the scars of battle. One constable had been wounded. Such was the interest in the ambush that on Sunday the 9th of January, the ambush had been on the Friday night. On Sunday the 9th of January, the railway company had to put on extra carriages on their trains, such was the number of people coming out to look at the ambush scene. Meanwhile, Tom O'Brien and the bodies of Tom O'Brien and Michael McGrath were taken to the barracks, to the military barracks. Michael McGrath was identified by his union card. He was a carpenter by trade, and he had his trade union card in his pocket. Volunteers going on active combat were usually ordered not to bring any form of identification with them, but his union card was in his pocket. The body was released the following day on the Monday, And there was a huge crowd at the funeral mass in the church on Parnell Street. When they came out from the mass, the British Army had a large presence along with the RIC. The British Army said no more than 40 people could accompany the cortege to Cabhrú Cemetery near Tramore. It was very tense, but Vincent White intervened, the Sinn Féin mayor of Waterford, and agreed and asked the crowd to disperse. And so Michael McGrath was taken to his grave. There was no identification of the body of Tom O'Brien. His body was later claimed by Liam Raftis, the city clerk, and he was buried in Ballygunner. During the truce, it was disinterred and reburied in his family plot out near Dunhill. Nicky Whittle, lying there among the furze bushes. There he's seen beside the shrine many, many years later. He crawled and hobbled away. At the first house he stopped, he sought entry and he was refused. The people did not want to get involved. Second house had the same story. Luckily enough, a distant relative of his lived nearby and made his way there. They took him in and sent for Dr. Purcell in Waterford, who was sympathetic to the IRA, and he came out and treated his wounds. The next day, Paddy Paul and William Keane took Nicky Whittle and Michael Wylie, the other wounded, to the mental hospital St. Othran's, where the staff were very well disposed towards the IRA and they treated him there. The IRA put around the story that Nicholas Whittle had died. A funeral mass was organised for him as part of the cover, but the British Army were very, very sceptical about this. They wanted proof that he was dead. So they started wide-scale searches for either Nicky Whittle or for his body. A friendly sergeant in the RIC tipped off the IRA that the mental hospital was to be raided and searched. And just in time, Tom Brennan and a couple of others got Nicky Whittle and Michael Wylie away from the mental hospital. The hospital was searched and 3 of the attendants were arrested and later interned. Nicky Whittle was brought first to Kilmeaden, then across the river to Paula Chapel in South Kilkenny, before finally going to England, where he could make his recovery in relative safety and comfort. Now, within the IRA itself, within the East Waterford Brigade, there was wide-scale recrimination. Why had Paddy Paul not been present at the main point all the time? Why was it done at night time? And it soon became very personal. People were saying, what else would you expect from Paddy Paul? All his people always voted Redmond. You had that kind of carry on. The IRA then carried out an GHQ in Dublin, sent down 2 officers to examine. The IRA were very much a learning organisation, and they were interested to learn the lessons of what had gone wrong. And their conclusions: the ambush position was far from suitable, but best available. Our force is not extended enough for a convoy of 4 lorries. They didn't expect 4. The Waterford number 2 men should have been more to the rear of the barricade. They should have been near the barricade. But because of the premature shot, the fighting fell only on shotgun men. Verbal orders were misunderstood at times, trying to shout orders in the midst of all the gunfire. What they also said is there should be a pre-arranged system of signals using loud whistles, especially if the order was to retreat. And it concluded, Waterford number 1 Brigade should not have undertaken such a large operation. Too big, as the men had never before fired a shot in anger. The men had neither the discipline, the morale, or the arms for such a fight, especially night fighting. And they cited the indiscipline. They concluded the warning shot, the premature shot, was fired by a shotgun man from Ferrybank who had been drinking before, possibly to give himself courage for the fight. But they said there was no point in following up on that, since at least one other was in a similar condition. Paddy Paul decided the best thing now after that was to try and get back on the horse. So he planned another operation for the 7th of March. It was also a very elaborate operation. There would be a diversionary attack on Dunmore East Barracks. This would all happen about 8 o'clock in the evening. The opening span on Waterford Bridge was to be raised. British troops trapped on the far side of the bridge would be fired on from Mount Misery. And then the primary target, the patrol, the normal nighttime patrol, would be expected to respond and to proceed to the bridge. And as they did so, they would be fired on in the Glen and Bridge Street. On the night, the diversionary attack on Dunmore East RIC Barracks took place. The opening span on the Waterford Bridge was raised. And that's all. Not a single shot was fired in Waterford, even though all the preliminaries had gone to plan. When Paddy Paul sought to find out why the next day, he asked the men, and they all said, the Vice Brigadier William Keane came around to us and said, "Why should you get shot for Paddy Paul?" William Keane was immediately dismissed. Michael Bishop appointed in his place. The rest of the brigade officers then refused to accept any other orders. They refused to take orders from the Brigadier Paddy Paul. They had a meeting, these officers. At a meeting, and they wrote to GHQ on the 25th of May. At a meeting of the brigade staff and battalion councils of the Waterford No. 1 Brigade, called to ascertain why the fighting was not being got on with in this brigade, it was the unanimous opinion of the meeting that the brigadier was not competent. At this stage, a new brigadier was called for. Then it said, "We have now once again unity in our ranks, and we can promise GHQ the immediate full cooperation of this brigade in the great fight at present being waged by the gallant men of other brigades throughout the country. We would ask GHQ to communicate with the late brigadier and request him to hand over all communications to the new brigadier, Michael Power from Tramore." Now, you can imagine how GHQ would respond to a letter from that. As far as they were concerned, this was mutiny. The immediate response from Richard McCarthy, IRA Chief of Staff, was, and bear in mind he was a Waterford man, the proceeding was entirely irregular. I have instructed the OC, that's Paddy Paul, that he must remain in charge of the brigade and his orders must be obeyed by all officers in the brigade. I have not ordered any suspensions, as I don't know where suspensions would have to stop. And the brigade commandant did not consider it advisable. And then he says, "Personally, I could not get any good of any officer in Waterford or get any scrap of organisation in the brigade until the present brigade commandant, that's Paddy Paul, took command some months ago. He has put the brigade on something like a satisfactory footing. I think his own work has been done in a very orderly, disciplined and complete manner. His principal offence in the eyes of those who are criticising him is that he endeavours to make them do fighting work, and that he will not agree that talking about fighting or even planning fighting is work." So total support for Paddy Paul. Despite the split, both sides of the split, the Paddy Paul loyalists and the men who supported the new brigadier, tried to continue on some element of harassment of the British. In his monthly report in May, Paddy Paul talked about destruction of British Army supplies, trenching of roads, seizure of bicycles, etc., low-level harassment of the British. And then he says, I was not responsible for the operation on the 25th of May, in which the City Battalion was brought from its base for the purpose of demolishing bridges. During the operation, which continued until the morning of the 26th of May, an enemy cyclist patrol came in contact with one of our sentries, whom they seriously wounded, and he died the following day. 3 of our men were captured while returning to our home. That man was John O'Rourke, a volunteer from the city. He was killed, he was shot out near Holy Cross, badly wounded, and while he was being carried towards Dunhill, died at Risk. Paulo was also critical of the selection of John O'Rourke as a scout, since he had very bad eyesight. But that's the kind of recrimination that was going on. Eventually, Liam Lynch, commander of the 1st Division, of the 1st Southern Division, decided to call a halt. He carried out an investigation himself, aided by a trusted Cork colleague, Sean Hyde, and decided Waterford No. 1 and No. 2 brigades to be combined, Pax Whelan to be appointed brigade, Paddy Paul to be brigade training officer. He described Waterford City, where, he said, a disgraceful free hand left to the enemy, especially at bases. But above all, he said, Waterford City was to be developed for action by sending in trained men to shoot any British Army soldier, British soldier, or RIC men that they could say. And Lismore Battalion was transferred to the Cork No. 2. So this was the reorganisation. This was the end of the 1st Brigade, and the whole lot now became simply the Waterford Brigade. Summary. The ambush of Pickardstown, as I say, was a defining event. The East Waterford Brigade was relatively weak. Initially, the leadership was weak. They lacked resources, arms, finance, and infighting, particularly after Pickardstown, infighting and blame. But despite that, enemy forces were tied down. Enemy forces, particularly the Devonshire Regiment, which could have been used elsewhere by the British, was tied down in East Waterford. Now, how would things have happened after July with the focus on getting fighting starting? We will never know, because the truce intervened. But it's important in March to remember the commitment and sacrifice of the volunteers. The 4 men who are dead, James Power, Michael McGrath, Tom O'Brien, John O'Rourke. Those who were wounded. The many, many others who were imprisoned, interned in Ballykindler, in Curragh, in the Curragh, Spike Island, and Bear Island. In March 1922, cabhrú opened the first shrine. The shrine was later rebuilt in 1947 to its present state. And I think it's important to remember the words of cabhrú as he spoke at that opening in March 1922. And he spoke of the bravery and the commitment of the 2 volunteers who died. But he also spoke of the bravery and the commitment of the others who took part in the ambush, who were willing to sacrifice their lives, who were willing to go into the gap of danger. And not only should we remember Michael McGrath and Tom O'Brien, but also John O'Rourke and his monument on the Risk Road where he died. I think it's time that we should all remember all of the men who died. Thank you.